In August, a retreat for Appalachian artists in Bledsoe, Kentucky, had to be cut short after a conservative Christian mob invaded their rental space, falsely claiming that the participants were desecrating a local chapel. Let me back up. The event was run by a nonprofit group called Waymakers Collective, which provides grant money and learning opportunities for artists in the region. They say they've given away over $1 million to date, and this retreat was supposed to mark their second annual gathering. It was a 3-day event that took place at Pine Mountain Settlement School, PMSS. I don't make the acronyms. It's an 800-acre campus with dozens of buildings. The school's website says, "We have hosted everything from church retreats to theater conferences to recording sessions." Given that many of the Waymakers members had attended events there in the past and always felt welcome, safe, and had positive experiences, it seemed like a perfect place for the occasion. The schedule included performances, meals, lectures, and free time for the artists to explore their creativity among like-minded peers. As someone who makes content and writes a lot and has to constantly deal with distractions, that sounds pretty amazing. To have a few days to myself where I don't have to interact with anyone, but if I choose to, it's with other people who make things, how cool would that be? Importantly, participants also had an option to visit the chapel on campus as a healing space. Waymakers explained it this way. The healing space was something we instituted last year when our gathering occurred right after the flood in eastern Kentucky. And we knew many of our participants traveling from eastern Kentucky were coming off of weeks of relief work and being impacted by the floods themselves. We chose to continue that offering this year. It was a spa-like environment to help facilitate restorativeness, rest, and reflection that we invited people to use however they wanted to. Take a nap, sit in quiet meditation, or prayerful reflection within their own religious and spiritual traditions. Again, that sounds lovely for anyone who might want to use it. If you have to deal with work or kids or constant interruptions, then something calm like that could be a game changer, or at least a temporary source of relaxation. I mean, just look at this picture of the healing space. Organizers said the chapel was decorated with pillows, soothing lights, plants, and a painting that included an Om symbol, presumably to facilitate the meditation. And that painting is what this controversy is all about. While the Om symbol wasn't meant to be religious in nature, when some people in the community saw pictures of the painting, because the artists were sharing images online of how cool this retreat was, they flipped out over the idea that a non-Christian symbol made its way into a supposedly Christian space, even though PMSS is not a religious location. Waymakers organizers said they were told they had use of the entire campus as part of their rental agreement, and the only restriction regarding the chapel involved the pews. They were told not to move them because the floors were recently resurfaced, which everyone was fine with. In other words, there was no reason the painting should have been a concern for anyone. It was there for a couple of days, and then it was going to be removed. On the second day of the retreat, however, an estimated 8 or 9 community members who were not part of this group took matters into their own hands. They barged into the space and entered the chapel to make sure the house of the Lord wasn't being disrespected. Tate Napier was the mob member who posted about the situation on Facebook, and he told a local reporter this. "The people in the chapel said they were doing nothing wrong. And I asked if they were in there to worship Jesus, and a few started raising their voices at me. So I told them to just get their stuff, that we weren't there to argue, and I even helped them gather their things and pack them to their cars. After that all happened, the state police and sheriff deputies showed up, and they agreed to stay out of the chapel. But then, ultimately, they decided to leave because they said they felt unsafe. If they want to do that stuff, they can do it in their own homes or buildings or wherever else. But it's not happening in Jesus' house as long as I'm around to defend it." What the hell? Why was he there? Why were they supposed to worship Jesus in there? What business did he have telling them to get their stuff? Why was he acting like gathering their things and putting it in their cars was a form of generosity on his part? I mean, for someone who thinks meditation should happen at their own homes, let's remember that the chapel on this campus was not his home to defend. He made it sound like he was merely escorting out people who shouldn't have been there, when in fact, he was the one who didn't have access to the space. Neither did his colleagues. I feel like this is the right time to tell you one important detail about this Tate, about this deeply Christian man who wants to defend Jesus at all costs. A few years ago, our buddy Tate Napier was charged with first-degree sexual abuse after being caught in bed with a 15-year-old girl. He was over 20 at the time. He's a child sex predator, and he loves Jesus. I just thought you should know that. Anyway, one of the artists in attendance didn't see the mob's actions as helpful in any way. Can't imagine why. Referring to them as white supremacists, Cabrera James said the invaders alleged the artists were desecrating their space and demanded that we leave. The artists left in order to avoid escalating the situation, which was understandable given that a lot of them come from marginalized communities. White people invading a space occupied by LGBTQ people and people of color isn't usually the start of a story with a happy ending. And if you don't want to be in the local news, it's sometimes easier to de-escalate in order to protect yourself. Now, shortly after the conflict began, a staffer associated with PMSS showed up and played mediator, which the Waymakers later said they appreciated. Eventually, police were called in by both PMSS and some of the artists who felt like they were in danger. According to Waymakers, we were also then told that the executive director and board of the PMSS had ordered our group to not return to the chapel during our stay. How does that make any sense? I don't know. The artists didn't do anything wrong here. After all this, and after they had some time to decompress, Waymakers released a lengthy statement expressing legitimate concern about why their safety wasn't paramount in this situation and why their contract wasn't honored. What was ultimately at issue was the safety of our collective. So we asked the PMSS board and leadership, why were children, families, and our guests put at risk in this way? Why were outside people who were not part of our gathering allowed to be present on the campus and interrupt our private, paid-for event? Why were there no safety procedures in place that the staff could follow to keep the people who rent PMSS safe? These were some of the many reasons we made the call to end our event a day early and leave PMSS for the safety of everyone in attendance. Many of our participants are deeply traumatized by this experience, especially those of us with personal lived experiences of racial and gender-based violence. Those are fair questions and legitimate concerns. The local reporter who published a piece about this said it's unclear if the chapel was a part of the Waymaker Collective Retreat Facility lease agreement or not, but the Waymakers certainly believed they had access to it. Hell, their version of the story involves specific advanced discussions about using the chapel. It's why they agreed not to move the pews, remember? I thought everyone hearing this story would be on the side of the artists, but you know who wasn't? The most prominent local politician. Dan Mosley is the Harlan County Judge Executive, which is like a mayor, and he offered support for the mob. I have a lot on my mind this evening, but I'm going to be brief. I'm proud of the people of Bledsoe and Big Laurel. Your perspective is my perspective, today and in the days ahead. It's always better to ask questions than throw stones, and civil discourse is always the best pathway to resolution. And then he threw in a Bible verse. Your perspective is my perspective, he said of the intolerant Christians who magically claimed ownership of a space that wasn't theirs. Mosley added separately that seeing an Om symbol in the chapel made me sick at my stomach. which is a weird thing to say about a symbol that's about as non-violent as a symbol gets. He basically praised the mob for taking a stand for Jesus without resorting to violence, as if they deserved a reward for merely threatening the artists rather than doing something even more insane. The comments on that first post overwhelmingly agreed with that position, as did many others in the community. This is apparently what they do in small towns. As I make this video, there has been a formal response from the Pine Mountain Settlement School. They explained that they asked the Waymakers to relocate the healing space after the mob invaded, and the group agreed, but before that could happen, the police got involved and people were scared. They did not explain why the Waymakers were told to relocate, but they said this at the end of a long statement. Pine Mountain Settlement School will always be an inclusive space for those who strive to explore, learn, or break bread together. We have not and will never share the values of those who oppress, endanger, or silence others, and we will continue to welcome everyone to our historic campus in a manner consistent with our mission and tradition. The school is reviewing its policies and procedures to ensure that this type of misunderstanding does not occur in the future, and to ensure the safety of all guests, visitors, and staff. Okay, I guess. I still don't know why they didn't do more to protect the artists, and did more than they should have to appease the mob. As of today, there's also a moratorium on the use of the chapel. So, congratulations, Christians. Now no one can use the chapel to praise Jesus, even though that's not what the chapel was being used for in the first place, and even if the artists were contractually allowed to temporarily decorate the chapel as they saw fit. This was nothing more than an act of white Christian supremacy that thankfully didn't end with violence. The victims were LGBTQ people and artists of color, including ones who were practicing Christians themselves. If county leaders and PMSS officials aren't going to take this seriously, and the invaders face no consequences for barging uninvited onto private property, it's hard to imagine anything will change.